Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Lori Pastriak, and I am the Director of Interpretation at the Fairfield Museum and History Center. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's program with Dr. Jenny Hale Pulsipher of Brigham Young University. And Dr. Pulsipher is going to give us an amazing glimpse into the incredible life story of Ann Prask. But before I introduce and welcome her to the program, I just wanted to take a quick moment to, of course, thank you. We are so grateful to have you here joining us tonight. Here at the Fairfield Museum and History Center, we welcome, so many different presenters for so many different programs, education and exhibitions, and so many opportunities to talk about history and how it's brought us to where we are today. And I'm really proud to be able to welcome tonight's presenter with a broad range of presenters across the month of March, of where we're really honoring the work of women and the history women for Women's History Month. And so tonight, welcoming here to the Fairfield Museum History Center, Dr. Jenny Hale Pulsipher, who's going to talk a little bit about the incredible life story of Ann Prask. Ann was actually alive in the Fairfield area back in the early 17th century, which is just this incredible period of time in our local history. And, Jenny here tonight is going to talk a lot about that time period and how different it is today, but also honoring the Native culture and Native American history of the local area, which during that time had, been, given a huge change with the introduction of English people and European people to the local area. And I know she's going to highlight a lot of that history tonight. So with much ado, I just would like to take a moment to introduce Dr. Pulsipher, who is a professor of history at Brigham Young University. And she specializes, of course, in early American and American Indian history, which is exactly what we're talking about today. Dr. Pulsipher has been out at Brigham Young for 22 years, and her first book, I will say, I read myself, is The Subjects Unto the Same King, Indians, English, and the Contest for Authority in Colonial New England. And that was published back in 2005. Tonight, we're going to talk a little bit about her book, Subjects Unto the Same King. Subjects. Her newest book, which was published just a few years ago, Swindler Sachem, the American Indian Who Sold His Birthright, Dropped Out of Harvard, and Conned the King of England, which was published by our neighbor, Yale University Press, in 2018. And so with that, I also wanted to note that it was a pleasure to meet Dr. Pulsipher a few years back at the Mashantucket Pequot Museum and Research Center, where we talked a lot about 17th century history and the Pequot War, which the Fairfield Museum is currently working on a grant from the National Park Service American Battlefield Protection Program to honor as well as help preserve the history of the Pequot War, which took part in Fairfield in 1637, which I know Dr. Pulsipher is going to talk a little bit about tonight. And so with that, hello, Jenny. How are you?
Hello. Happy to be here.
We're happy to have you. Thank you so much for joining us all the way from across the country. Thank you to technology for allowing us to do this. So is there anything I missed there in your introduction that you'd like to add?
No, I've spent a lot of time doing research in Connecticut. It's a great place to learn history.
Absolutely. We have a lot of it from a lot of different angles and a lot of different people. So thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. And I'm really excited. I will say I have read the Swindler Sachem book, and I very much enjoyed it. A lot of familiar characters from my background of studying history from the Pequot Museum all the way here to the Fairfield Museum. So I'm really looking forward tonight to taking a different angle of how we normally talk about the quote unquote settlement of the town of Fairfield, perhaps from a different perspective, a young Native American woman. So I am going to just allow you to take the stage and chat, and I will bring up your presentation for you now.
Thank you. Well, I'm very happy to be here to talk about someone who I'm sure almost none of you have ever heard of before, Ann Prask, or Ann Prask Wompas, a remarkable, largely unknown 17th century Native American woman. I came to learn about Ann Prask in the process of writing my most recent book, Swindler Sachem, which is actually about a man named John Wompas, who Ann Prask married. And you know from the title of this book, John Wompas was something of a character or a rogue. He was a man who was Nipmuc Indian, who was raised partly in Nipmuc society and partly in English society, was one of the few Native children who were brought into grammar schools to prepare them to go to Harvard. And he actually did attend Harvard University for a few years, but then decided the goal of becoming a minister was not for him, that instead he wanted to become a sailor. So he left and began a career as a Native American sailor on English merchant ships and also as a land speculator. So the reason for that title, Swindler Sachem, is because he both pretended to be a sachem when he actually wasn't one, and because he sold native land without native permission, and got in a lot of trouble with his native kin for doing so. But later, towards the end of his life, he seems to have realized that that was not the way to go and tried to make some kind of restitution. Well, in the process of learning about John Wompas, who left quite a trail in deeds and court cases, I came across his wife. And her name was Ann. In various records, it's Ann Wompas or Ann White, because he sometimes used the English name White, which is essentially a translation of Wampi, Algonquian word, which also means white. But her original name was apparently Prask. On one of the two documents which John Wompas submitted to the King of England, petitioning for his help, he mentions his wife. So here in this pulled out part on this slide, it says, "Your petitioner, by marriage of Anne, the daughter of Romanok, late sachem of Aspetok and Susquehanna, upon the death of the said sachem, is become the proprietor of those tracts of land upon which the town of Fairfield in Connecticut colony is built." So this was the claim that John Wompas made, that by marrying Ann Prask, who was the daughter of the sachem of Aspetuck and Susquehanna, he became the proprietor of the land on which Fairfield was built. And this became the subject of a number of lawsuits in the 1680s. Now the early part of this story centers around the Pequot War. And the reason for that is that's what brought Anne and John into the same orbit. So this map shows southern New England, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Plymouth. And the Pequot War, probably the most famous battle of that war, was the massacre at Mystic Fort. And when that massacre took place, a number of the survivors and those who were not at the fort but were nearby fled from the English attackers and their native allies, including Narragansetts. They fled westward along the coast of what is now the state of Connecticut, and finally ended up in the place that is now the town of Fairfield, the Sasquatch area. They were seeking refuge. And when they got to Sasquatch, they sought refuge with those people. And they retreated into the swamp, Munnocommock Swamp, also called Pequot Swamp today. The Sasquatch were not participants in the Pequot War, but they were likely in a a relationship of subjection to the Pequot Indians. The Pequot had become quite a dominant people in that area among many native groups. And as people who were either in subjection to or allied with the people, it was really, with the Pequots, I mean, it was really their obligation and their expectation to provide shelter when they needed it. So they allowed the Pequot to join them, and they retreated into the swamp. The English caught up with them, laid siege to that swamp, and after a couple of days, Thomas Stanton, a well-known interpreter who lived in Stonington, Connecticut, went into the swamp and was able to negotiate their surrender on terms of mercy. Now, in this time period, when someone engaged in a war surrendered on terms of mercy, what that meant was that they would be allowed to live, but that they could be enslaved. And that's in fact what happened. At least 200 women and children who were inside that swamp came out and were taken captive by the English and became slaves. Some of them were enslaved within the state, well, what is now the state of Connecticut, then the colony of Connecticut. Others were taken to Massachusetts. Some of them were also taken into Narragansett and Mohegan communities. One of those people who was taken captive at this time was Ann Prask. This shows kind of a close-up view of the town of Fairfield in the 17th century. Later, after it became an established town, there was no settlement there at the time of no English settlement at the time of the Pequot War. It was land held by the Saskwa, the Aspetuck, these other native groups. But in the aftermath of this siege, this attack on the Pequot Swamp, the English assumed that that land had been forfeited by conquest, that they had won the land by right of conquest. Now, not all Native people agreed with that, but that was the basis on which the English later moved into Fairfield and began building their town. So how did I make the connection between this woman mentioned in John Wompas's petition to the crown as the daughter of Roanoke and this slave child? Well, it came about through the trail of land deeds and land lawsuits that follow in the wake of John Wompas as a result of his many land sales. And also through some interesting probate records that got left in the aftermath of Ann Prask's death in Boston in the year 1676. So this is a deposition taken at the time of her death by a woman who was with her when she died, a woman named Milka Wright. And she says that just a little while before she died, she said to Milka Wright, Anne said, what estate soever she had, she would give to Mr. Hughes, his children. So that his is like an apostrophe in modern English. It just means possessive. Mr. Hughes's children after her death, for the love that their father had shown her. For she said that Mr. Hughes, if he would, might have made her a slave all the days of her life. So when I came across this document, I thought, what does that mean? I knew she was married to John Wompas. I knew that her land had been sold by him, land that was where the town of Fairfield is now sitting. It never occurred to me that a woman, a native woman who held land, could have been a slave. And I was really surprised about that. And I started asking around to my various colleagues, how could she have been a slave? And one of them suggested that maybe she was actually a slave from the Pequot War. I had not thought of that because it made her older. So you see the assumptions that we sometimes bring to our history, to our historical analysis. It made her older than John Wompas by 5 to 15 years, which is not the usual thing. But apparently in this case, that's what happened, that she was taken captive as a child, enslaved as a result of the Pequot War. and taken to Massachusetts. There she met John Wompas. Well, how did that happen? Let's look at the process of this enslavement again. As I said, Thomas Stanton went into the Munnocommock Swamp to negotiate with the native people there. He made a speech and told the Sasquatch and Pequot Indians that the Pequots were the English great enemies, and that if they, the Sasquatch and Pequot Indians, would come forth and peaceably surrender themselves to English mercy, they should have their lives. So that's just another example of what happened there that made her enslavement possible. Many slaves were taken in the Pequot War, nearly 400. John Mason, a famous early colonial settler in Connecticut, wrote a brief history of the Pequot War, and in it, he talked about a particular group of slaves taken in the Pequot War, 180 captives. And of them, he said, whom we divided, intending to keep them as servants, but they could not endure that yoke, few of them continuing any considerable time with their masters. So he makes this comment, and a number of historians have analyzed that and looked at the fact that there were, nearly 400 slaves taken in the Pequot War, but within a few years, most of them cannot be found on English records anymore. They ran away. Some of them died because of contact with English diseases. But gradually they just disappear. And even though the English are able to find some of them returned to their native communities, eventually they accept the fact that they are not going to return. So it's an interesting process. It appears that the English intended for them to be perpetual slaves, but because they knew the area, because they were enslaved with other people who could speak their language and who they were familiar with, they were able to free themselves from this captivity. But Anne didn't get freed. Anne remains in her household. Why didn't Anne escape when so many of these other slaves from the Pequot War did? Well, there's again evidence in the documents surrounding these land sales that give us a hint as to why she may not have escaped. This is from a testimony of a number of Native people in the Fairfield area. And they said that Munnocommock, Ann Prask's father, so Prask was her native name. She was often called Ann Prask, using both her native name and the name the English gave her. The Indians testify that Munnocommock, being a great warrior and often fighting with strange Indians, got many wives, one of which died at Mahican called Albany. And having then a child about 5 years of age called Prask, was fetched from thence by Munnocommock and brought into these parts. So this tells us that when Prask was about 5 years old, her mother died near Albany, so up in Mahican country. And Munnocommock came to fetch her and brought her down to what is now Fairfield. His own home place was near the Hudson River. So here's a child, a 5-year-old child, who we don't know exactly when she was brought from what's now the New York area near Albany down to Fairfield. It might have been just before the Pequot took refuge in the swamp with the Sasquatch and Pequot Indians. If that was the case, she probably didn't know the language that they were speaking. A 5-year-old girl who may not have been able to communicate with the other captives who were taken in the swamp. Her father was not with her. When the swamp was surrounded, he and about 20 other men, native soldiers, escaped and ran north. So he was not taken captive. She was. Too young probably to have the ability to communicate with those around her, and quickly sold to an English family. That English family was the Hughes family, who lived in Roxbury. Roxbury is now a part of Boston, Massachusetts, but at the time it was a separate community. This is a map that shows a small part of Roxbury. And one of the interesting things that you can see from this map is the fact that Anne lived with Joshua Hughes, which was just, within viewing distance of the house of Isaac Heath, which is where John Wompas was living at this time. His father, known in records as Old Wampuas, had sent him to live with Isaac Heath, thinking that he would be able to learn the English language and gain some advantages that might be able to come back to help his people. So John, as a child, probably around 9 years old, went to live with the Heaths. And at that time, Anne had been taken captive and sold to the Hughes family. When she joined the Hughes family, again, she was probably only about 5 years old, and there were no children in the family at the time. Joshua was fairly recently married to a woman named Mary Hughes. Within a few years, they had a couple of children, and then Mary Hughes got fairly sick and became bedridden for a number of years, and Anne basically raised those children. She was the main helper in that household, raising the children, feeding them, taking care of the household while Mary Hughes was ill. In that time, in that fairly small community of Roxbury, they were not the only Native people. There were a number of other people who'd been taken captive in the Pequot War and lived in that town. So they would have seen people when they attended church and when they went about their business in the town. Over time, those children either died of disease or ran away. And so they would have seen fewer. But within the town of Roxbury, there was also a grammar school where a teacher who was believed to be quite talented at teaching Native children started taking some of those Native children into the grammar school to prepare them for going to Harvard. So it was actually a place where they would probably have seen a number of other Native people. Now, they lived there together for a few years, and then Mary Hughes died. Joshua Hughes took his family and moved to Boston, and undoubtedly went with them to continue caring for the children. And then within a few years, he remarried in Boston. Within a few years, John Wompas left Roxbury as well and moved to Cambridge to continue his education in the grammar school there in preparation for going to Harvard. But around the year 1656, something really interesting happens. Up until that time, as I said earlier, the assumption was made that the land that Fairfield was built on had been surrendered by the Native people in war, that it was the spoils of conquest. Even though the Sasquatch and Pequot Indians were not Pequots, they had not been at war with the English. The fact that they had given refuge to the Pequot made them guilty in the eyes of the English. So they, by giving refuge, had surrendered their rights to the land according to the English. So the English were living on that land, and they believed that it was theirs, even though they did not have any deeds, they had never paid the Native people for them. It was just the assumption that they had won it by conquest. Now, in a lot of other towns in Connecticut and in Massachusetts, when English people had come in and started settling, they had made a point of going to the Native people and securing deeds, paying them usually a very, very small sum for the land, and then securing deeds, which gave them a way to say that the land was theirs, to justify their possession. That had not happened in Fairfield until about 1656. At that point, a number of Native people started meeting with the English people and asking to be paid for the land, and the English people started giving them kind of cursory payments for that land. Well, what prompted this? Why had they gone nearly 20 years without any kind of payment? Well, some of the documents that exist talk about John Wompas going to Connecticut in 1656, and it seems like he was looking for Roanoke. And shortly after that, Roanoke makes a deed out and grants the land that Fairfield was built on to his daughter. So this is a partial copy of that deed. And you can see it says, I, Roanoke of Aspatock, doth freely give all that land commonly called by the name of Aspatock unto my daughter called by the English Anne. I do hereby give unto her heirs, and etc. So this is a copy of his deed of that land to Anne. Now, interestingly, this copy appeared in a book that was published in the 1950s, but that deed has since disappeared, which is something that has happened to a number of Native deeds over time. But this is the deed that he gave to Anne. He did not sign any of the other deeds that start being signed in the 1650s and 60s. He keeps his name off it. And I speculate that perhaps John Wompas talked him into doing that, to not selling the land then, but holding it so that he could give it to Anne. And that's what happens in 1660. Interestingly enough, in 1661, something else happens. And that is that John Wompas marries Ann Prask in Boston. So this is a chart made up based on the marriage records that are kept in Boston City Hall, or at least were when I made this copy. Now I believe they're the archives, in the state archives. So on May 21st, 1661, John Wampany, that's one of the names he goes by, Wampany, Wampaneag, Wompas, marries Ann Prask by Major Atherton. So this is not a church marriage. Many of you probably know that in the Puritan colonies, marriage was a civil act, not a religious ceremony. So one of the colony magistrates, Major Atherton, is the one who married them. Shortly after that, John Wompas sells a portion of that land that Roanoke had deeded to Anne to a group of men from Stonington, Connecticut. So here's what it says. Your petitioner's father-in-law, this is coming from one of his petitions to the king. Your petitioner's father-in-law about 19 years since delivered up possession of the said lands to your petitioner, John Wompas. And sometime after, the petitioner sold part thereof to Captain Dennison and Amos Richardson and others of Stonington in Connecticut colony for the sum of 530 pounds sterling or thereabouts. So how is it that John Wompas has been able to sell this land? This is a very interesting example of John Wampas's kind of bicultural dealings. He was educated in both Native and English ways. He understood how the English people sold land. And as a result, he practiced something that legal scholars like to call code switching. So code switching is when you switch from one kind of legal way of doing things. So for instance, Native American land ways, the way that they conveyed land in Native culture, and the English way of doing things. And this is an example of him doing that. He's getting deeds that are witnessed and signed and registered in English courts, but that are based on Native practices. So he claims that Roanoke is a sachem. Sachems in Native society were the ones who had the right to give land or to assign land or sell land. So he's using that Native structure, but making sure that it's also recognized in English culture. Let me give you an example of that I think is just fascinating. So later in the century, a number of lawsuits center around this land. So you remember John Wompas has claimed all the land that Fairfield is built on by virtue of his marriage to Ann Prask. That's using that English legal system of coverture. So in English law, a woman was not able to own land or sell land or sign contracts or represent herself in a court of law. She was, quote, covered under the identity, the legal and political and economic identity of her father or husband. And so by marrying Ann Prask in an English system with, verified by an English magistrate and registered on English books, he became the owner of the land that her father granted her. It seems like this might have been an instrumental marriage, one kind of carried out for practical reasons, that he saw that she had at least a claim to a substantial tract of land, knew that he could get access to that by marrying her, and so did so. Now, we don't know that that's what happened, but there are some suggestions, as you'll see later, that their marriage was not really a happy one, and that he does marry her very shortly after she is granted this land, and then very shortly after that, he begins to sell it. When he sells it, he makes sure that both the native and the English landways are in place. Here's an example. Thomas Minor, a resident of Stonington, Connecticut, gives testimony in this 1684 case that Roanoke had acknowledged Prask as his daughter, and other Indians did as well, and that several Indians said she was the proprietor of the whole tract of land in and about Sasqua, and how her right came by her mother and grandmother, and that he saw her take possession. So that tells us that in 1660, Ann Prask was actually in the Fairfield area when Roanoke conveyed that land to her, that she was there in order to take part in that legal transaction. Now, a really interesting part of that transaction is not only is the native kind of landway there, the fact that a sachem has conveyed the land to his daughter, thus making her the proprietor of the tract, but various English ways are in place too. One is that Thomas Minor is there witnessing the transaction. So that was necessary in an English legal transaction to have witnesses. Another is that they participate in a turf and twig ceremony. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever heard of that. A turf and twig ceremony is an ancient ceremony. It was considered archaic in 1684 and certainly after that. But it was kind of a traditional way of representing how you conveyed land. In a turf and twig ceremony back in Old England, someone who was selling a land to someone else would cut a piece of turf out of that land. And then they would take a twig and stick it in that turf and then hand it over to the person they were selling the land to. You can see how you might want to have a ceremony like that if the people who were participating in the ceremony were not literate, because it has a really strong symbolism that you're giving the land and the things that grow on it to that other person for some kind of a fee. So they carry out this ceremony representing that land transfer. So a good chunk of that land gets sold after it's conveyed to Ann Prask. She marries John Wompas. He begins selling the land. Now, I don't know if you noticed, he sold the land for 530 pounds sterling. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever looked at some of the deeds that were made between Native people and English people in this time period, but 530 pounds sterling is the highest amount I have seen in the entire 17th century for any land sold by a Native person to English people. Now, I don't know for sure if it took place. The deed doesn't exist anymore. That sum is reported on John Wompas's petition to the king. That's what he claims he sold the land for. If he really did, that was a huge amount of money. typically, and on the land deeds that start coming out in Fairfield in the 1650s and 60s, land is sold for, say, 13 coats, or the equivalent of maybe 10 or 15 pounds, just a fraction of that 530 pounds, which tells us that John Wompas was able to put his understanding of the legal system to good use, his dual understanding, by demanding that very high payment for the land. So shortly after John Wompas and Ann Prask begin selling this land, a very interesting transaction takes place. They buy a house. They buy a house that is on the edge of the Boston Common. And they live in that house for the next about 10 years, 10 years living in that house. A number of writers in the 19th century and the 20th century have commented on the fact that this is the only house, within Boston and in the Boston records that was sold on the English market to a native person, native people, John and Anne. So they buy a house for about 70 pounds. Now that's a lot of money. That's the English price for that house. How did they get enough money? Well, that's one piece of evidence that suggests that maybe that 530 pounds John Wompas claimed he got for selling Fairfield land, maybe he really did get it, because he was able to pay for at least half of the house. He pays for half of the house at the time that he buys it. And then he takes out a loan because he's unable to pay the second half of the house. This is an excerpt from that land deed, which appears in Suffolk Land Deeds in Boston, where they take out a loan to pay the rest of that mortgage. And I've also included here the clerk's sketch of the marks of John and Ann Wompas. We don't have the original. The way that these deeds usually work is there are two copies. One of them goes to the buyer, one of them goes to the seller. And eventually, if they take it to the court and register it, then the clerk will make a copy of it into the records of the town. And that's how we know about the land transactions. If they never take it to the court, if the clerk never makes a copy, you don't even know that it existed, especially if the copies that the buyer and the seller had get lost, which many of them do. So this is not the original, but the clerk's signature, the clerk's writing, copying of that deed. The interesting thing about the Suffolk County clerk is that he made a real effort to represent the way that the people's signatures look. So if you look through the Suffolk court files, you'll notice fairly elaborate signatures, very simple signatures, marks. He tries to reproduce those marks. So this is the closest that we can get to seeing what Ann Prask's signature looked like. And if you look there, it says the mark of Ann Wompas and a seal. And between mark and of, there is kind of a graceful looking A. Most Native people were not literate. There were a good number who attended various grammar schools who were, but the majority of Native people were not literate in the early 17th century. They often signed deeds anyway, but it was often with a mark, an X or an O, or something that they used to represent themselves. The fact that her A looks kind of practiced suggests that maybe she had some schooling during those years that she lived in Roxbury. There is an account of a Pequot girl who apparently attended the grammar school in Roxbury for at least a time. So it would not have been necessarily unusual if Anne did. And this signature suggests that maybe she could write. And if she could write, it's very likely that she could read, because reading was taught first and writing followed. This is a map of Boston showing where the Wompas family lived. So I've circled it in yellow highlighter. You can see that number 1, that's John and Ann Wampas's house right there on Boston Common. The property where their house was is now a church, an Episcopal church, and has been since the 19th century. And a number of writers have commented on it. Nathaniel Bowditch made a funny comment, well, not really funny, but kind of a typical 19th century comment where he said, where he pointed out what a huge extreme there was between, these heathen Indians and the Episcopal Church sharing the same property. So it kind of gives you an idea of 19th century attitudes towards Native people. But it was unusual. It certainly was unusual to have Native people owning a house on Boston Common. And a number of people commented on it in later years. What's perhaps even more unusual is the fact that nobody commented on it at the time. It seemed to be just kind of taken in stride, which raises a lot of interesting questions. So as I mentioned, John Wompas and Ann Wompas seemed to have kind of a troubled relationship. If only we had a journal by Ann Wompas or by John, or letters between them. Unfortunately, we don't. We have to kind of trace their lives through more circuitous paths, through the land deeds, through the court records. And one thing that we find out is that in the year 1664, Anne and John had a child. They had a daughter named Anna. This is the only example of a Native birth being recorded on the Boston town records in the 17th century. It records Anna being born born to John Indian, it says, and Anne White, again using that Wompas White name that goes back and forth throughout these records. It's not clear how long Anna lived. The death records for Boston were lost between the years of about 1665 and 1683. And so we don't know how long she lived. We do know that by about the year 1676, she was no longer living. And it may be that she died as a young child. Possibly this death had a pretty significant impact on their marriage, as deaths often do. But we do know that by 1673, John and Anne had kind of a troubled relationship. We know that through the court records. So this is from the Suffolk court records, which give an account of an incident that took place near the home of John and Ann Wompas. John and Anne were in some public place, probably a tavern, and John at the time was drunk. And Anne hits him. She strikes her husband with her hand or with whatever she can get a hold of, I guess. And someone calls a constable complaining about a breach of the peace, and they get committed to prison. Anne is soon released, and so is he, but they're committed to come back and answer for their bad behavior. And it's clear from these records, it's very interesting that John has gotten into kind of a habit of some fairly heavy drinking that is driving a wedge between him and his wife. And he gets a pretty significant fine. He gets put in jail and is bound to good behavior, 40 pounds worth. So he has to put up 20 pounds bond for himself and 10 pounds each for 2 witnesses. She doesn't show up for this first hearing, but he's required to make sure she shows up later, and she does. And when she does show up, she's treated with almost kid gloves. She's not charged. She's not given any kind of physical punishment. She is reprimanded and then just let go. as if the court understands that she is, that her striking of her husband was in a way understandable. Now, we learned some interesting things about Ann Wompas through another really fascinating document, her probate records. Anne dies in 1676. Shortly after this incident that takes place between her and John, he disappears. He goes to sea, and he apparently does not make any effort to stay in contact with Anne while he's gone. He's gone for over 2 years, and she apparently comes to believe that he has died because he's been gone for a long time, and the mortality rate among sailors was pretty high. In 1676, she suffers a pretty significant injury. I'm going to skip ahead and then come back. I wanted to show you a picture of what a colonial era fireplace often looked like. They were big, open spaces. You would step into the fireplace and stir a pot that was over the fire. There'd be a fire burning right there on the floor. You would have water or liquid in that pot all day long, and you would just add things to it to make your various meals. So what happens is Anne gets scalded. She gets burned. Perhaps she tripped and fell into the pot, and the water sloshed on her arm. Hard to say. But as you can see, it would be pretty easy. This is a very accessible space of very hot things. So she gets scalded. And over the course of a couple of days, she gets infected. The burn gets infected, and she dies. Before her death, as we mentioned before, a couple of the people, the women who are with her, helping take care of her, take depositions about her desires for her estate. And then after her death, an inventory is taken. And this is fascinating. This is a Native American woman living in Boston. And she has an estate. I didn't include both pages, but you can kind of see it from if you can read that early handwriting. She has an estate that is worth 120 pounds, plus an additional 37 pounds of debt that is owed to her. That is a substantial middle-class estate that this woman has. And if you look at her inventory, there are items on there that are somewhat surprising. Things like a feather fan with a silver handle, some silk stockings, some leather gloves, a mirror. Some of these are upper class items. She also has dozens of pieces of linen, 40 pieces of head and wrist linen, ribbons, other kinds of things, more than any single woman would need. So what's going on here? It seems to be that Anne has been working in concert with her husband before he left. He was doing something sailors often do, which is buying small items, luxury items, often in ports that they visited, bringing them back in their chests. They were allowed to bring back a certain number of things in their personal chests and didn't have to pay taxes, import taxes on them. So it was a privilege that sailors had. And then giving them to his wife, who could then sell them. So she's apparently carrying on some kind of a business in her home during the years that John is gone, selling linen, wrist linen, ribbons, luxury goods like a feather fan with a silver handle, and doing fairly well for herself, well enough that she was able to make 2 loans. One loan of 17 pounds to Mr. Robert Sedgwick, another loan of 10 pounds to Mr. Richard Knight. Knight was a shopkeeper. So they're kind of fellow merchants in a way. This is really remarkable. And she does this through the years of King Philip's War. Now, those of you who know things about King Philip's War know that Native people were actually not allowed to stay in Boston during the war. But she does. So either she's keeping a low profile in this home that she lives in, or she has, in a way, become accepted as a member of the society. She wears English clothes. She lives in an English house. She attends an English church. In all of these accounts around her death, she is not referred to as Indian, which most other Native people are during this time period. So it's interesting. There's some different thing going on here. Now, I read you earlier the deposition where she says that if Mr. Hughes would, he might have made her a slave all her life. Well, apparently he doesn't, because she stops being a slave about the time that she marries John Wompas. And she seems very grateful to Hughes for this, that he has released her from a bond that she had assumed was lifelong. It's not clear exactly when or why he does that, but it's possible that he was promised a share in some of the land sales that John Wompas was making if he would give her up, if he would release her from her servitude. One of the reasons that that seems like a possibility is that later, when these land court cases come up in Fairfield from people trying to claim the land that John Wompas sold them, one of the claimants is Joshua Hughes Jr., the son of Ann Wampas's master, who was dead at this time. In the aftermath of her death, John Wompas comes home, and he goes to his house and finds that Joshua Hughes, Mary Hughes Lamb, and Hannah Hughes are living there. Those are the children that Ann Prask raised, the ones that she cared for while she was a slave to the Hughes family. And she bequeathed the house to them at her death. She doesn't even mention John Wompas, which again seems to be a suggestion that she thought that he was dead, and that the courts must have accepted that too. He'd been gone for such a long time. So when he comes back and finds the Hughes there, it's likely that they inform him that Native people are not allowed to live in Boston. And then he quit claims the house to them for a very small sum. The house is worth about 100 pounds at this point, but he quit claims it to them for 20 pounds. As I said, later on, after John Wompas himself dies, he has left his land to various people he's in debt to, including a number of Englishmen living in England. If you remember, John Wompas had gone to England a couple of different times to seek the Crown's assistance in his ability to continue selling land, which the local colonial governments had told him he couldn't do anymore. While he was there, he sold his land in the Nipmuc country and in the Fairfield area to English people. And they claim it. They go down and try to claim it. And the courts are horrified. The people in Fairfield absolutely refuse. They say, they have no right to it. And there are a bunch of interesting court cases that go on. Eventually, they reject the claim. They reject Romanock's right to the land. They reject Prask's right to the land. They use every means they can to claim that the land belongs to the English, not to any Native people. But for a while there, it's looking kind of iffy. But it works out in Fairfield's benefit. At the same time, it raises a lot of really interesting questions. For instance, one of the depositions I read to you earlier talks about the fact that Romanock had granted the land to his daughter. Okay, so if he did, that means Native women could inherit land. Another deposition says that the land that Romanock gave had come from the mother and grandmother of Ann Prask, which again suggests Native women had land ownership. That land may have passed on matrilineal lines. So it's an interesting support for that idea of Native matrilineal inheritance. It was rejected by the English, but it's an interesting thing for us now to consider. Ann Prask's story raises so many interesting questions. not only about land ownership, but about her ability to sustain this life within English Boston for so long without interference. I think I've used up probably more than enough time, but I would be very happy to take any questions. And also, let me just briefly say, if you want to know more about Ann Prask and John Wompas, I talk about them in my book, Swindler Sachem. I've also created a digital archive. And if you search on Google, the digital archive of John Wompas, I have put all of the documents that relate to this story on that archive. You're muted, Lori.
Thank you. It was being so good. I was going to drop that. Actually, I'm going to drop the digital archive of John Wompas link in the chat to this video, which is currently being broadcasted, and it will be hosted on both the museum's YouTube platform and our Fairfield Museum Facebook page as well. So people will be able to see this. And I can't tell you how fascinating this history is from a variety of perspectives. First, of course, the life of a Native woman in 17th century Fairfield, as well as Boston, is just remarkable. The whole insight into John Wompas and his political nature of not only navigating the native, his native kind of understanding of, he's a Nipmuc. He is not from the Fairfield area. He is from Eastern Massachusetts, closer to Boston. He's navigating so many different spaces at that time, which were under possession of the white English way. And there's such a conversation that we have at the Fairfield Museum in which we acknowledge the town of Fairfield, its quote unquote founding of 1639, just after the Pequot War. And then there is never any conversation about this idea of Native occupation and the dispossession of Native people that happened with this English claim of conquest after the Pequot War. And I know our shared research in 17th century the Native landscape in New England is remarkable and complex. And your ability to put together these stories of people who are often lost to time is remarkable. So thank you for all of your work. My big question is, and I always am so curious about how we put together these stories, these microhistories, and how they impacted the daily life of the fear of the white English men and women who were living in Fairfield at this time, that they were going to lose their land to a Native girl. Whose father said, oh, no, here's all the land. And she can come in and say, oh, nope, it's all mine. Time to go. I can just imagine the fear and the court of law that was just trying to add this. Now, you mentioned that John Wompas was traveling back and forth to England during this time. Could you touch on a little bit about why he was traveling back and forth to England and why he was asking the king to grant him? Because I find this fascinating as well, the politics of early 17th century Connecticut.
I find it fascinating too. So as I mentioned earlier, John Wompas is selling Native land that he does not have the permission of his kin to sell. And so, he does have a right to some of that land. It's land that his family has traditionally used, but he can't sell it without the permission of the sachem and the people who traditionally use the land. Yet he does. He sells it as if he was the sole owner. Well, naturally, his relatives, when they find out about it, complain to the English government and say, you cannot recognize these land sales. This is illegal. And eventually, the Massachusetts government revokes his ability to sell any Native land. So they won't let him sell it anymore. Well, there goes his major stream of income. So his first trip to England, he goes with the intent of appealing to the king and saying basically that he's being deprived of his right to sell his own land. He doesn't happen to mention that the land actually belongs to other people who don't want him to sell it. He leaves that out. So he tells a partial story to the crown and gets a letter from the crown saying, do justice to my subject, John Wompas. So he comes back to Massachusetts and shows that letter to the governor. And the governor says, what do you mean do justice? You're not doing justice to your relatives. And they still don't allow him to sell the land. At that point, he goes down to Fairfield and says, okay, if I can't sell land in Boston, I'm going to sell it in Fairfield. And he goes and starts laying out, doing a survey of Fairfield. And just like you mentioned, Lori, people are up in arms and they throw him in jail. And he manages to escape from jail and goes and finds someone who he thinks will help him. And they appeal to the Connecticut colony court, but they reject it. And so he goes back to England again to make a second appeal to the crown to, again, do justice to the native people, and gets another letter. In fact, they send a letter to the Connecticut colony magistrates chastising them for abusing the rights of native people, which they did do sometimes. But in this particular case, it's complicated. So that's what he's doing.
I thank you so much for that explanation. I know in Eastern Connecticut, this is a very similar thing that's happening with the Mohegan land and Uncas as their politically savvy leadership. But in both of these cases, there's so much power that are attributed to the women, and the land in which that is attributed to their family, their kin, and the different manipulation of local politics, colonial politics, crown politics, and then native politics. There are so many spheres that interconnect in this history, but unless you don't understand how to find this in the primary resources, it's very complex. And not to mention the aliases. John White, John Wompas, Ann Prask, Ann Wompas, and White, to understand how they're navigating these spaces. It's just remarkable history. And it is an entirely different new way of looking at the town of Fairfield in this 17th century way of, we often think of, some people came and then they lived here and they set up town and everything was fine and all well and good. There was a couple wars, but really, it was great. No, it was contested and it was complex, and there was people coming in to survey that got thrown in jail, and then there's women coming. I mean, I just would love to time travel back to
this. When you mentioned Uncas, he's one of the people that they call to give testimony during these cases. And they're trying to find every way they can to deny that Munnocommock and Prask had a right to that land. And so he specifically testifies, and I don't know if we can take him at his word here or if he's just saying what they want him to say, but he says that native people do not convey land to women, that women cannot own land.
Uncas kept up that perspective, I think, for a variety of reasons. And there's a couple of reasons why I think that, but that's a whole nother program that we can talk about. Men and women and what they believe and why they believe it and when, right? Gender history is always so interesting. But no, thank you so much. We have a lot of thank yous coming in our comments, so I'm sure people found this very interesting. And again, like I said, it's an entirely different perspective on what we had traditionally told at the Fairfield Museum and in Fairfield as this founding. And our town seal, not to mention, is a native person shaking hands with an English white person and thinking about perhaps it wasn't that many handshakes that took place. I think it was a bit more contested in the court of law as well as in out of war. And so, we wanted to acknowledge that history, recognize that history. And so thank you so much for all of the research and for joining us tonight. As well as I'd like to note that I did drop into the chat the digital archive of John Wompas, and I will also drop in the chat where you can find Jenny Hale Pulsipher's book, the Swindler Sachem book that she mentioned tonight. It is remarkable, and the history is just so much more complex than even what she gave tonight. And although we focus on Anne tonight, John Wompas is one of those interesting characters of history. So I highly recommend it. And you weave a wonderful story with, incredible facts and primary resources to back it up. So we appreciate that history and that research.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your semester out at Brigham Young University. And thank you again for joining us. And a special thanks to everyone who is watching tonight. You can also find all of the rest of our programs always online at our website, www.fairfieldhistory.org. And we are, of course, a nonprofit community-supported organization. So if you like this, you can also make a donation on our website tonight to help keep this free program growing and, of course, honoring Women's History Month this month of March. Thank you. And I hope everyone has a wonderful evening.